Back to the podcast, John Wesley Anderson. John, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. And thank you and Lance for having me back on your show. I've really been looking forward to this program.
Awesome. We will have you back on the show anytime you want. You've been
Good.
on the show in the recorded
Hmm.
sense, where we have the opportunity to, take out our ums and our deep breaths and our start and stops. But this is live. And it's the first time you've joined us live on YouTube, so we can field some questions from the
Hmm.
listeners, from the audience out there. And thank you to the audience for joining in. Make sure you tell your friends that we have John Wesley Anderson on, and he is a expert in the JONBENÉT Ramsey murder. So yeah, thank you to the listeners out there. And John, can you, for the handful of people who are not familiar with you, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I can, Lance, and thank you for the introduction. I'm a career law enforcement officer, 30 years total, 22 years for the Colorado Springs Police Department. Retired as a sergeant when I was elected the sheriff for El Paso County, Colorado. It's one of the larger law enforcement agencies in Colorado, about a little over 500 personnel when I was there, and I was term limited, so I went into the corporate world, spent 10 years with Lockheed Martin, retired, and after 40 years working for either government or corporate environments, I became self-employed as a consultant and an author. I've always wanted to write. This book is Lou and JONBENÉT is about one of my former homicide partners, and thank you, Tim. Lou and JONBENÉT, a legendary lawman's quest to solve the child beauty queen's murder. And Lou, this photograph on the cover of the book shows Lou on the first day that I was sworn in as the sheriff of El Paso County, January 10th, 1995. And Lou was sworn in as my captain of detectives. And when we were both with the Colorado Springs Police Department, he was one of my homicide partners, and he was 20 years older than me, so he was kind of an older brother and kind of a mentor, and became my best friend. And so when I was elected the sheriff, I invited him to come to the sheriff's office to take over a cold case of a 13-year-old girl who had been kidnapped and murdered in the unincorporated area of El Paso County, where I reside. And within 3.5 months, Lou had the suspect identified, in custody, and within 2 weeks, the suspect pled guilty and took a first-degree plea on a cold case. That killer, his name's Robert Charles Brown, BRWNE, ended up pleading guilty to a second first-degree murder that Lou and his team put together, and eventually confessed to 49 murders. So if they're all true, and we think they probably are, he was certainly one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And that case had languished for 4 years under the previous administration, seemed to be going nowhere. And with essentially the same evidence, in that case, it was latent fingerprint. The team that Lou put together and the momentum that he generated to solve that case was what I felt is what they needed in Boulder. So Lou had retired from the sheriff's office when the murder of JONBENÉT occurred, and we always had stayed in contact with one another. And he had told me that the district attorney in Boulder, Alex Hunter at the time, was looking to put together a task force to investigate the Ramsey investigation. And Lou said, you may be getting a call from the DA because he's doing some due diligence, wants to know, if I would recommend Lou as part of that team. So of course I did when the DA called, and I told Alex Hunter at the time, I said, just do what I did when I was first elected sheriff. I gave the case to Lou, told him that I'll support him with anything that he needed to clear the case. And within not even a couple of weeks, probably the next time I talked to Lou after he joined the task force, that was probably March of '97 in Boulder, that he started seeing things that were wrong in the investigation. And Lou Smith was the first and only man initially who were saying, now wait a minute, I'm seeing evidence of an intruder. I don't think the Ramseys were involved in this murder. Up to that point, everybody else, to include the police department, the law enforcement community, the media, pretty much everybody had focused on somebody in the Ramsey family. either the mother, the father, or the son. And that was really the complete focus. Lou was the first person to say, wait a minute, that's not what the evidence is telling me. And he had the experience and the courage to speak out on behalf of the family. And then after 18 months working at the DA's office, when the case was being presented to the grand jury in Boulder, Lou had the courage to stand up and submit his letter of resignation to Alex Hunter and to proclaim the innocence of the Ramsey family, and that it was wrong to be trying to indict these grieving parents for a murder that they didn't commit. And then Lou worked that case for the next 14 years, the rest of his life, literally trying to bring justice for JONBENÉT on his own time and his own expense. And then when he passed away in 2010, his investigative notes and his computer and case file all got passed down to his children in his estate. And then after about 2 months, his children contacted me and a handful of other detectives, retired detectives at that point, and said, we're putting together a team to continue my dad's work. Would you be a part of that team? So that's what the book is about. That's why we're here today, is to talk about Lou's work and his effort to try to establish not only the proof that the Ramseys were innocent, but more importantly, that there's a killer out here, and that this case can still be solved through the DNA that was left at the crime scene.
Well said. Well said.
Excellent.
Every time you come on, you very articulately give your background, and then you bring everybody up to speed where the case is at the moment and your relationship to the case. I just got to tell you, for the 20 minutes before we started this conversation, I was searching for your book. It's gone. I've lost your book, and I apologize. I can't find it. So if I had it, I'd be referencing it. But I was going to ask, your description there, your explanation, is that something that you ever grow, I don't want to say tired of saying, but is that something that, is that something that has run its course for you?
No, not at all, Lance. And what a great question. Let me back up and comment on. I know you read my book thoroughly, so you probably don't need any prompting. But just for the listeners or the viewers, this book is available, Lou and JONBENÉT, through Amazon or Barnes and Noble in any format. And so like Tim he has a hard copy, and Lance, I think you might have had a hard copy too, but it's also available in paperback for a little less money. It's available as an ebook. So like Lance, if you wanted to, you could bring that up, on your laptop or whatever, and then you can do keyword searches immediately, for DNA or a person's name. But it's also out as an audiobook. And I've gotten to where I probably listen to more audiobooks than I do actually reading books, because you can, listen to them when you're in a driving or road trip or something like that. And so any format that the listeners enjoy reading their books or hearing about their books, it is available on this one through Amazon. And then, sorry, I kind of went off on a commercial there, but I wanted to make sure people knew that the book was available. And I'm sorry, Lance, now I've got to let you go back and restate the question that I interrupted.
All good. I was just wondering your feelings on that introductory statement that I'm sure you've said so many times.
Yes, thank you. And, every time in our team that we bump up, against a wall, and there's been a lot of speed bumps, Lou got, he had a lot of criticism, when he was still alive, and still people, criticize his work. And anytime I start, feeling sorry for myself, I just think back about what the Ramsey family has gone through and what Lou went through, all on his own. At least I'm part of a team, his children, Lou's children, and other retired detectives. So I'm just part of that team. I happen to be a little more visual with you guys because of the book and the Netflix docuseries that recently came out, but the rest of the team is there. And so we're supporting one another. where Lou pretty much was there on his own. And, although we would have conversations and he would talk to his family and friends, about the case, um, uh, I think, as long as he was alive, he was pursuing justice for JONBENÉT. But Lou developed cancer and knew that, his time was limited. And that's when he began, trying to organize the case so that it could be handed over. He put together a extraordinary PowerPoint presentation, 632 slides that are just phenomenal to see. 36 of those are in my book, Lou's slides. And then he had a PowerPoint presentation with a spreadsheet with 883 entries and 53 columns, and it captured so much about the case, the evidence, the people that were involved. And it was so organized, you could just instantly do keyword searches and find information. And he had prioritized, persons of interest in 4 tiers, tier 1, 2, 3, 4, depending upon, their priority. And then one of the other things that I really admire him doing is he spent 8 hours with his son-in-law videotaping himself, just talking to the camera and going through his slide presentation and sharing his thoughts on the slides. As he went through the slides about the case. And then that became a very important part of the Netflix docuseries, Cold Case, Who Killed JONBENÉT. And so you actually get to see and hear Lou explaining the case, and he knew the case better than any person alive. So in my book, I talk about, conversations that he and I had about the stun gun, for example, which he was convinced was used on JONBENÉT twice, on her face and then on her back, and or about the garrote and that she was strangled with, or the ligatures that tied her hands together with the slip knots. But in the docuseries, they did such a wonderful job bringing Lou kind of back to life through his video and letting him, explain firsthand. So instead of saying, listening to me, say, well, I remember Lou talking about this, why this was important. You actually get to hear and see him and what he's referring to. So it's almost like a first person discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, the docuseries on Netflix, Cold Case, Who Killed JonBeNét Ramsey, is just fantastic. And I know you had a part of the behind the scenes of that docuseries. So
Mm-hmm.
congratulations on that, and well done getting this out as far as you have, because Netflix certainly sometimes drives the true crime conversation when it comes to documentaries.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what's happening here again.
Yeah.
I do just want to mention the Smith family GoFundMe.
Oh,
I'm
thank
going to
you.
put a link here in the YouTube. And I also just want to ask who,
Mm-hmm.
if you could share, who else is on the team?
Well, Lou had 4 children, and Cindy, the middle daughter, has really been, kind of our pillar. She's the other children support when necessary. Dawn, the youngest daughter, is in charge of the archives, has all of Lou's case files. And then Mark is a computer wizard, and he's helped technology wise. But Cindy's has really been the driving force in putting our team together. We've been together now for 14 years, and she's the glue that's kind of held our team together as well. And then Lou has several grandchildren. 2 of them started their own podcasts about their grandfather and talk about the case. So they're very supportive. One of those is more involved with our. We meet almost monthly, not every month, but sometimes every other month, depending on what we're following and what our priorities are. So we have other retired law enforcement professionals that are donating their time. None of us are paid. We're all volunteers. All of us are no longer affiliated with a law enforcement agency. So, our access to computer databases, is very, very limited. And, whatever the criminal justice system is. And we really are restricted to just, collecting and testing DNA. That's pretty much as far as we can go. But Lou always said that's the key to solving this case, is matching the unknown male DNA that was found on JonBenét's body and on her clothing to whoever matches that unknown male DNA. That's really the key to the case. And Cam, I'm sorry, you had mentioned the docu-series, and I really have to compliment Joe Behringer and his team with Radical Media and putting this 3-episode docu-series together. It's based in part on my book, and when I wrote the book, I purposely wrote it with 3 parts and 3 chapters in each part. And that kind of follows the format for a Hollywood movie or documentary that has 3 acts and 3 scenes in each act. So 3 acts, 3 scenes, total of 9 scenes, hoping that when a producer picks up the book and looks at the table of contents, that immediately would jump out. And it did. And I was very lucky to get a call from the head of production for Radical Media. And he said, "Hey, John," he said, "I just finished your book, and I think there's a real potential here for, a docuseries. If we did," he says, "I just want to confirm before I pitch this to Joe Behringer that the book rights are still available, and you would be willing to support the production as a technical advisor." And I did confirm the book rights were available. They ended up passing on the book rights, and I understand why. I think the producer really wanted the freedom to produce the docuseries, the 3 episodes, the way he wanted to. And it probably came out better. He's a professional there. He knows what he's doing, and he has a professional team of writers. For those people that don't get Netflix, and if you're interested, you can look at the 2020 2-hour special that just came out about 2 weeks ago, and that's accessible online too. And it's titled "Forever Young: Who Killed JonBenéT?" And it covers a lot of the same information, interviews Joe Behringer, the producer, John Ramsey. And one of the last comments I want to compliments I want to add to the producer or director Joe Behringer. And I've not met the man. I'd love to do that someday. But the next day after the episode aired on Netflix, he appeared on one of the Good Morning shows, sitting next to John Ramsey. And he said, when I started this, he said, I'm kind of embarrassed. I kind of bought into the belief that the Ramseys did it. And that's what, we had all heard. But he's sitting next to John Ramsey, and he says, "I can tell you now that there's no doubt that nobody in the Ramsey family was involved in the murder of JonBenéT." And Lou Smith was right. There was an intruder. And I think that took great courage to come out and publicly admit that. And that's based on the fact that he had spent the last 6-8 months, in a deep dive in the case and meeting the people involved. And it convinced him without any doubt that the Ramseys were innocent.
Very good. I do want to just mention to the audience who is watching live that we can take your questions for John Wesley Anderson. So please put the questions in the chat. We will see him here. And there's one question I wanted to ask you, and it's kind of an interesting point here. Lance and I were talking yesterday about evidence in the case, and it seems to me that what is considered evidence for some people to point at someone is not evidence for other people. And can you just tell us a little bit of what is evidence in this case?
Yeah, in this case, evidence is, for example, the ransom note. Clearly, that's evidence. A 3-page rambling ransom note, very unusual. printed kind of block letters, not a cursive script kind of a writing, a flow to it. In studying handwriting examination, you have to look at the document, the material that was written on, the instrument that was used to write the note, or a bad check, or whatever you're investigating. In this case, the writing instrument, for example, to start with, was a felt tip pen, which is one of the worst writing instruments that you can use for forensic identification purposes. And you really need to compare, known handwriting to the document. And in this case, Patsy traditionally wrote, with script writing. That was her traditional writing style. But she was told, okay, copy this letter and it'll write it out. And there was some early indications that, well, we can't exclude Patsy from writing the note. That doesn't necessarily mean that she wrote the note, but one forensic examiner did make that comment, that we can't exclude her. So that went from we can't exclude her to she wrote it to she's lying. And that was really blown out of proportion. Lou found a total of 6 forensic handwriting experts. 4 of them said, I don't think that she did write it. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But the 6th one, who was probably the most experienced one, he had been with the Secret Service, he came out and said the exact opposite. No, there's no evidence at all in this note that Patsy wrote any part of this note. So the point is, though, that I have always believed, and this is after 30 years in law enforcement and being involved in the forensic sciences, in looking at question document examination and the results, is handwriting for identification and evidentiary purposes is very subjective. It's kind of, you can kind of get out of it what you want. Depends on, what side of the argument that you're on. The note itself is highly important evidence, but for identification purposes, it's questionable. So I think that needs to be parked aside. What is interesting is some of the wording, and I know you guys have gone over the note several times, but you'll start picking out terminology that are direct quotes out of movies that were playing at the time, to include in Boulder. Ransom was a good example. So whoever wrote that note had studied wherever they could about committing kidnaps for ransom, and use those same words. Don't try to grow a brain. That comes directly out of a Hollywood movie. And none of those movies were in the Ramseys' home. They never watched those movies. Why would they? They're watching, Cinderella or whatever with the kids. And so somebody spent a lot of time studying those to be able to craft that message. Also, at the end of the note, the SBTC, the initials, and the word victory with the exclamation mark, that's key too. That's really important evidence. We've yet to identify what those initials stand for, but somebody, the killer or killers, certainly knows. So the note is of great evidentiary value, but for forensic identification and scientific positive indications of who wrote the note, highly questionable. Another example, Tim, is it comes up all the time, is the pineapple. Whether or not, JONBENÉT had eaten pineapple, and if that showed up in the autopsy and her stomach contents, that may or may be the case. There was a bowl of pineapple, uneaten pineapple, on the kitchen table, and Patsy's fingerprints were found on that bowl. And so some people speculated, to include some law enforcement personnel out of the Boulder area, speculated, well, that shows that Patsy, was lying because, she didn't, admit that she had put that bowl there. Well, to begin with, examining stomach contents in a child's stomach the day after at the autopsy and trying to determine, how much of that vegetation material or whatever would be broken down is very difficult to determine. And did she have some fruitcake or something with pineapple in it at the party that they were at, the night before her murder? There's a lot of unknowns. but when people say Patsy's fingerprints are on the bowl in the kitchen that held the pineapple, and that means she's lying, that's just bizarre, because this is Patsy's home. I mean, you'd expect her fingerprints to be on, coffee mugs and bowls and plates. So what it shows is that she lives there. It doesn't show that she's lying. Did she take the bowl out of the kitchen, or out of the kitchen cabinet, and put it there and put pineapple in it? That doesn't show that sequence of events. Did she take the bowl out of the dishwasher and put it up there? So there are, in this case, some red herrings, that have really no evidentiary value. And some people may argue that with me, particularly the stomach contents. I will suggest, in trying to lead to the identification of the suspect, the pineapple means nothing. It just is really just kind of confusion, just smoke that's kind of out there. If you do get the suspect and you can compare the handwriting and make a comparison off of that print handwriting, well, then that might be valuable. But to say, from that handwriting that it's definitely Patsy, it is interesting that that same handwriting, that note, the written note, was also asked by Boulder PD for samples of handwriting from John Ramsey and from Burke Ramsey. Burke was the 9-year-old older brother of JONBENÉT. And there's just the 4 of them in the home, the mom and the dad, and then JONBENÉT and her older brother, Burke, who was 9. And the police do come out later and say the handwritten note was not written by John Ramsey, nor was it written by Burke Ramsey. And so that is an opinion that's out there on the note that starts excluding them. But I don't know that you can 100% exclude somebody just from the handwriting. But what you can exclude them from is the DNA. And when the DNA was offered by the entire Ramsey family, the day of the murder, the day after the murder, their hair, blood, handwriting was taken from Patsy, Burke, John Andrew, who wasn't even home, there at the time, all the Ramsey family, and then some other people, the housekeeper and some other people. Their blood, hair, handwriting was all collected prior to that December 30th of 1996. So 4 days after the murder, all of that comparison material, the writing, the hair, the blood, had all been collected and was being submitted to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, for comparison purposes. And within 2 weeks of that submittal of that evidence to the CBI, a report came back from CBI that excluded every member of the Ramsey family and the other people that were there, saying that their DNA does not match what was on JONBENÉT's fingernails and also on her panties, and that those two samples were compatible with one another. And it is male and it's foreign. It's unknown. It's no one that's ever been identified. So until we identify who that male person is that left that genetic material. But an investigation is a process of inclusion and exclusion. And even John and Patsy acknowledged that, the police have to look at the family and they have to rule them out. And that was the problem that happened here, is the police looked at the family and they couldn't get beyond them. Their speculation that, it was either John, because he found JONBENÉT's body, and whatever Detective Arndt's comments were, she looked into his eyes and knew she was looking in the eyes of the killer, or whatever that comment is that she has on the docuseries. It's just really bizarre. Steve Thomas, who was also a lead detective with the Boulder Police Department, wrote a book about this, and he believed that Patsy killed her. So here are 2 detectives from Boulder PD, same unit, same investigators, same information, who come to the complete opposite conclusion. But the real bizarre thing is that, for either one of them to have been accurate, then the family, the parents, would have been in conclusion and covered up the case by staging it. And then when you start looking at the physical evidence, it's like, well, how bizarre. How could they possibly have staged this sexual violent crime. And where would they get that foreign DNA? How would that, come about? So, I think one of the things that the docuseries has done is it's brought to light, some of the facts in the case. And I had most of those facts in my book, but I think when you read text from one author, you do get their voice and their opinions. But I think when you actually see the evidence, and that's what the docuseries I think really did, was portray the evidence and Lou's interpretation of the evidence, and then the viewers also you got to kind of see both sides. The people, the special prosecutors who prosecuted the Ramseys in the grand jury, and you got to hear from John Ramsey, and you got to see video clips of when Patsy was alive and when she was interviewed. And I think what the docuseries clearly does is show that these weren't two parents that are trying to cover up and stage a accidental murder of their daughter. These are truly genuinely grieved parents, and that this case was really botched right from the very beginning, and one series of mistakes after another, compounded by another, just to support their conclusion that the Ramseys did it. But I think the docuseries and 2020 and the book, I think all of that's beginning to shift that public opinion away from the Ramseys. And when you really study the evidence, then you start realizing that there is evidence to support an intruder here. There is a point of entry, a broken window in the basement. There's the comment about there's no footprints in the snow is because there was no snow on the south side of the house. But as Lou always pointed out, that DNA is undeniable, and that's what's going to solve the case.
Right, and it goes back to the DNA, yes, but people are behaving in a normal way, and that is what feels like to me what becomes this like guilty perception from the general public who hear these details, like John Ramsey found her. Well, he was looking for her. I mean, that's a simple thing. Patsy's DNA is on the bowl. Well, she owns the house. Right. But one thing that we spoke about yesterday, and James Cross is here, and he has a comment, and that was the same comment and kind of confusion I had as well, which was looking for the opinion on why the killer would leave a novel of a ransom note. I'm just reading his comment. A novel of a ransom note, and the body's in the basement, but the killer's still in the house. Why would a ransom note still be there after the murder had occurred?
And it's a good question, and it's something that Lou spent a lot of time on. And what he believed, and I think the evidence supports this, is that the killer got into the home when the Ramseys were away. They went to a friend's house for dinner in Boulder. This other couple has kids that were the same age of Burke and JONBENÉT, so they were out of the home. And Lou believed that's when the suspect entered the Ramsey home, and that he was in there for several hours. And that's when he wrote the note on the notepad that was in that main level near where that spiral staircase was. So Lou believed that the note was written when JONBENÉT was still alive. And it is nearly a novel. It's 2.5 pages long. It is a really unusual, bizarre kind of a note. And so what Lou believed is that the suspect was laying in wait, hiding, maybe on the second floor underneath the bed in the guest bedroom. And then after the Ramseys came home, they almost went immediately to bed. It was a long day for them, Christmas Day, and they were getting up early the next morning to fly to Michigan to have a second Christmas with John's older children. And so they knew they had an early morning. And what Lou believed is after they'd gone to bed, everybody's asleep, that the killer went into JONBENÉT's bedroom, may have used the stun gun on her the first time, right below her right ear, and that may have caused her to not be able to scream out. Don't know that for sure. But Lou thought that might have been an impact. Then Lou believed that he carried he or they, because he always left it open to possibly being more than one suspect, but he said he believed that Lou believed that JonBenét was taken from her bedroom to the basement. So there's 4 levels in the house. There's a main level and then a basement, and then the second level where JonBenét and then Burke slept in that bedroom, or I mean, on that floor opposite bedrooms. And then there's an upper floor. That's where the parents slept. It'd been a big attic, and they'd converted that into a master suite. So there's four levels there. And so when Lou believed that when the abductor takes JonBenét from the second floor, goes down the spiral staircase, and he's headed to the basement, that's when Lou believed the suspect leaves the 3 pages of notes on that bottom step. Then he takes JonBenét to the basement, and it's in the basement where Lou believed that the killer was perhaps trying to take JonBenét out of the home through that same broken window that Lou believed the killer had gained entry into the home. Something happened, whether she's fighting or he couldn't get her out of the window or whatever, but the plans change if in fact it was supposed to be a kidnap for ransom, which Lou believed was all along the intent. And then the killer moves her while she's still alive into another room. It's called a boiler room. And that's where Lou believed that she was sexually assaulted, violently sexually assaulted, and murdered in the boiler room. And then after she was deceased, her body was moved to the next room, which is indicated on the crime scene diagram as the wine cellar. And Lou's diagrams are also in my book if somebody's interested. So Lou believed after the murder, the suspect leaves through the same broken window that he gained entry through downstairs. So Lou didn't think the suspect ever got back up to the main floor or any other floors after the murder, that he leaves the residence right away. So he never, picks up the note. So the note and the location where it was left clearly shows that the killers knew the pattern of the family, because there's another set of stairs that are in the house. So if he'd left them on that other set of stairs that go all the way up to the attic, then they may not have been found, who knows, for hours. But the killer must have known that somebody was going to go down that staircase and walk by those stairs to see that note. And that's exactly what happened when Patsy got up about a little after 5 that next morning and started downstairs to put coffee on, whatever she was going to do in the kitchen, is when she found the note and then told John. And that's when they find that JonBenét's missing. And that's when they dial 911 and call the police.
Now I know we've not so much today, but we've in the past gotten comments about cobwebs around that window, that point of entry, that basement window. Yeah, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and there's a great quote that Lou is very familiar with, and it comes out of Sherlock Holmes novels, and it's Sherlock Holmes who cautions, says, do not allow the facts do not allow the theories to dictate the facts. Allow the facts to dictate the theories. So the point being is, if you look at evidence or a fact and now you try to twist it to fit your theory, then that's flawed. You should be allowing the facts to dictate the theory. So Lou's theory, and I should mention this, that he didn't go to Boulder with this theory. He probably went like most people. Not probably, he did. We talked about this. I think when he first went up there, he thought it was going to be a pretty simple case that was either going to be somebody in the family, either the mother did it or the father did it. But he's basing his opinion just off of what all of us had, the forced entry, no footprints in the snow. And it wasn't until he saw that that's not true, that's not accurate. And then, so when it gets to the point of entry, the window that leads to the basement, the room they called the train room, there's a heavy metal grate. And John Ramsey had locked himself out of the home, and to gain entry, he crawled into that window well, and he broke one of the window panes. It's about an 8-inch pane near where the lock is, and he reached in and unlocked it. This is the summer before the murder, and he lets himself into the home, and then he closes the window and secures the lock. When he goes down, right minutes before he finds JonBenét's body on the morning of December 26, 1996, he points to that window and he says, that window was left open. So that's the window I broke. I let myself in when I locked my keys out. But that window wasn't like that. And he says, look, he said, there's a suitcase down below that window and it's standing upright. And what Lou found was that it was easier if you stood on something to get out of that window. You could get in okay, but getting out was kind of a different story. So Lou was convinced that the suspect had placed that suitcase there to get out of the home. So coming in through that window or leaving theoretically would have disrupted the cobwebs. However, cobwebs, as everybody knows, do they, lay over to one side or they blow over to the other side? Because later the police take photographs of the point of entry and they say nobody went through that window because there's cobwebs here. One of the other things that's interesting about the cobwebs is how quickly spiders can weave a web. It only takes maybe 12 hours, for them to create a spider web. So there's nothing to say that the web was already there and came afterwards and was reconstructed or blew in there or whatever. So Lou thought that the spider web was not evidence of nobody came through that window. He thinks, well, that's, was interesting, but it doesn't exclude the possibility of someone coming in and out of that window. And then when you look at the other evidence, such as the on top of that suitcase, there was a little piece of a white packing, the white peanuts that you use for packing material. And there were some broken pieces of glass. It looked like somebody had stepped on that. And then they brought some of that debris that was in the window well to include some dried leaves into the home. And one of those dried leaves was found in the boiler room where the wine cellar where JonBenét's body was found. So it looked in Lou's mind that was evidence of somebody, bringing in that material as they transfer that material as they went into the crime scene after crawling through that window. So Lou thought the totality of the evidence clearly, supported that window being an intruder. So when you look at evidence and you try to dismiss it as not being valid, the caution here is, again, make sure that you allow the facts to dictate the theories, not the theories to dictate the facts. So when someone says, well, I think it's the parents, that's my theory, and you try to look at the evidence from that point of view. The train tracks is a good example. One of the Boulder law enforcement detectives wrote a book and said, he thought the marks on the face and on JonBenét's back were caused by train tracks from that room that Burke had jabbed his sister in the face with these train tracks. Now, one thing that is confirmed there is the dimensions between the wounds on the face and on the back are 3.5 centimeters apart. The train tracks on that gauge of model train is 3.5 centimeters from the outer edges. However, what Lou pointed out is that's really nonsensical because there's 3 rails on that model of train track, and the center rail is the only one that has electricity going through it. And anybody who's played with model trains knows when you pull the tracks apart, you no longer have electricity that's not completing the circuit. So there's not going to be an electrical thermal discharge or burn that's left. And so somebody was trying to twist their theory. I think the train track was used to create those marks. What Lou did is he took it to that whole next level. And when he reached the conclusion, this was after he had left the Boulder DA's office investigating the case on his own, he became more and more convinced that those marks showed that this stun gun was used on JONBENÉT twice. And why that was so important is the parents didn't own a stun gun. They didn't even know anybody who owned a stun gun. Another theory that, to make sure I mention here, is the theory of transfer theory, that whenever a crime is committed, the suspect either takes something or leaves something at the scene. And that was an investigative principle that Lou knew very, very well. And when he pointed out, for example, the black masking tape that was found, that was over JONBENÉT's mouth, when her father found her down in the basement, and he pulled that black masking tape off of her mouth, that was like a 6 or 8-inch strip of masking tape. But there's no roll of masking tape, duct tape, not masking tape, duct tape, anywhere in the house. And what Lou said was, well, there has to be a parent roll, because it was torn on both edges. So if we could find, the roll, you could match that torn edge and prove that. So what Lou said is, no, this is something else that was brought into the crime scene along with the stun gun. And then the other really compelling piece of evidence was the tie down, the ligatures that she was her wrist constraints in the garrote was fashioned with a cordage. It's called paracord 550, which in '96 was fairly uncommon. Now you see more of it. It's even in different colors for different purposes. You'll see. I have a piece of it right here. Well, I won't bother looking up, but it's really lightweight, durable cordage, and to keep it from fraying, you traditionally would hold a match under the end and it would melt that end. And what Lou was convinced was that showed a sequence of harmful events, and that one of the ends had been melted on the cordage, the other one was frayed, and then on the tie down marks, that both ends were frayed. And so what Lou believed in reconstruction, the harmful events, is that someone from a continuous piece of cord had pulled out a sufficient length to fashion the garrote, which was used to not just to strangle her, to kill her, but to control her. And then the ligatures that were used to tie her wrists, that wasn't just tying her up to stage it to look like to cover up an accidental murder. Those were slip knots that were intentionally designed, that the more she struggled, the tighter that they became. So that was somebody who clearly had an intent to immobilize someone in that home. So, and there was no paracord anywhere in the house. So Lou said, when you look at those three pieces of evidence, the duct tape, the paracord, the stun gun, that all shows, the intent was to commit a kidnap for ransom consistent with what the ransom note says, and that those items had to have been taken after they left the house. They left the parent roll, the rest of the paracord, the duct tape, and then they took the stun gun with them. But, those are things that can be easily discarded, after the crime. But what can't be discarded, that Lou always pointed to, is this killer's DNA. That was left at the scene, and that's what's going to solve the case.
Okay, I just want to read one of these comments that has come up from somebody calling themselves Socially. I'm going to try to do my best reading this. And then I have a question right after this comment that was posted. It says, isn't it odd for a murderer to cover up and tuck in a body after being killed? And if it was a sexual assault, why was she not naked? I think they're saying, why was she not naked? Why was she redressed? It's been proven, like this was a sexual assault, right?
No doubt. Yeah, there was, I don't want to get too graphic with your listeners, but there's clear physical evidence at the autopsy of sexual penetration with a foreign object, to include bleeding and absolute overwhelming evidence, according to the coroner, who was a medical certified pathologist, that this little girl had been violently sexually assaulted. So there's no question about that.
Okay, so can you give your opinion on why she would have been redressed and not naked?
Yeah, and there's no indication that I'm aware of that she was completely undressed and ever naked. What I do think there is evidence on the long johns that she was wearing for pajama bottoms. That's just what she'd been wearing Christmas Day. And when they brought her home, they just tucked her into bed. They didn't take off what she was wearing, these leggings, and put pajamas on her because she was sound asleep when she came home. Her dad just carried her upstairs. But in 2008, there was another analysis done on the long johns, and just below the waistband, there was biological material consistent with either trace or touch DNA. And what the belief was is that showed that someone had pulled the long johns down, not necessarily taking them off, but pulling them down and then pulling them back up. And that biological material did match what was underneath the fingernails and also on the panties, on the crotch of the panties. It was foreign, not known to anybody. It was male. And so it also confirms, in Lou's opinion and mine, that this killer left his DNA not only on her undergarment, but on the long johns, and that underneath her fingernails, when she's struggling to breathe, to get a grasp for air, and to undo the garrote, that's when she's scratching the assailant. Her biological material's obviously there, but there's a foreign, unknown male, possibly even two unknown male samples. That was commingled, so it's not been really definitively proven, to my knowledge, if it was one or two samples, but they've never been identified, that unknown male.
Wow. Okay, here's a question from James that I would love to ask, or it's really more of a comment. He says, just think of all the mental gymnastics that is required to explain away all the stuff that points at the parents, though. It's kind of crazy, to be honest. Question to James, but also to you, John. What is the evidence that points to the parents?
Well, that's really a good question. And how much of that is legitimate? I'll give you an example. Is legitimate or questionable? Again, on the 2-page CBI report that I sent to you and Lance, and you're welcome to post that. It's clear that the Ramseys provided, to include John, Patsy, Burke, and John Andrew. They all provided their handwriting, their blood for the DNA sample, and that was the day after the murder or the following day. But on the 30th of December, 1996, that's when that CBI report was submitted to CBI, listing those persons who had voluntarily given samples. But on that same day, December 30th, 1996, Boulder police hold one of their very first media press conferences. And the public information officer, she makes the statement that that they've gotten samples for forensic comparisons from everybody in the Ramsey family except for Patsy. And then she speculates, and she says something about, well, it might be because she was too distraught. Well, that was either a deliberate misrepresentation of the evidence. Some people believe that it was to force one parent to crack and give a confession or admission, or admit the other parent did it. But that was a lie. That was either an inadvertent lie. It was either a misstatement, or what I believe it probably was a deliberate, deceitful information that was put out by the police to the media, who ran with it. That was put out all over the world. The media sources, tabloids love those kind of comments. But it was a horrible thing to say because it wasn't true. And many of the Boulder detectives knew it wasn't true because some of them were there at least two, and wrote a report that said, that Patsy did cooperate. She did give her blood. She did give her samples, and they even talked about how she was crying when she did this. And in their supplement, they said, she even commented, "Will this help, find who killed my baby?" And for them to know that, and to allow this misinformation or deliberate lie to come out is just wrong. It is also wrong that they told the media that we should have the results in a couple of weeks of the DNA analysis. And in fact, on the 15th of January '97, when CBI gave the report with the analysis to the family, which excluded the members of the Ramsey family with the DNA, the police acknowledged receiving the lab report, but they refused to share what the results were. They also refused to give a copy of that, or even to tell the family that, yeah, this DNA excludes your family. So they continued to investigate using this comment about the parents are under this umbrella of suspicion, and withholding information that didn't fit their theory that the Ramseys did it, hiding evidence. They hid that CBI report for at least 7 months, and had it not been for Lou Smith, I don't know that would ever seen the light of day. So yeah, this is a real example of how not to investigate a homicide.
Yeah, totally. I want to address Susie's comment here. Could the intruder, assuming that, like, if this is, we're going down the intruder theory path, could the intruder have been someone that the Ramseys know, someone that was invited to the Christmas party at their house and hid out the entire time?
Well, the Christmas party on Christmas night was at a neighbor's house, not at their house. There have been other people, in the home many times. So Lou believed that the suspect probably had been in the home prior to this. Don't know if that means that, he came in, with, another group, to look at the house when it was set up for the previous year, for kind of a parade of homes, that the Ramseys had allowed their home to be used for a couple of Christmas seasons, bringing in people for donations, to look at homes in the Boulder area. Or if it was part of a work crew, they had a major remodel. But Lou thought it was such a large home that this person probably had either been in the home before, and had a sense of where things were laid out, and where the bedrooms were positioned. He didn't think that the person had just come in, went right to her bedroom. He thought that he had been in the home most likely several times before.
Yeah, I think that's a fair belief there. I know that John Douglas did some work on this case as well, and John Douglas was one of the first criminal profilers from the FBI's Real Science Unit. And he even wrote a book, and it wasn't completely about the JonBenet Ramsey case, but he did spend a large section of that book talking about the case. And he's on the same page as you and Lou. And so if there is more skepticism out there, I do just want to mention that, because whether or not some listeners had heard of Lou Smith before this, he is genuinely regarded as a wonderful detective. And I think the public perception of John Douglas is that he was a wonderful investigator as well, and criminal profiler. One thing he mentioned, and I reviewed this before the show, but one thing he mentioned was that when killers will stage a scene, typically they set it up for someone else to find the murdered victim, and that obviously wasn't the case here with John, because John himself found JonBenet. But my question to you is there a profile of the killer that you believe holds water?
I think the profile is someone who was a previous uh, violent sexual offender. And Lou didn't believe that, and I don't believe this either. This was just done spur of the moment. As with most sex offenders, they start younger and then they escalate, in violence. And this was very elaborate. There were a lot of things that needed to happen, things being brought into the crime scene, things taken from the crime scene. Lou believed that this kind of a pedophile had almost certainly preyed on young girls previously, and probably afterwards too. And tragically, sex offenders is one of those criminal offenders who can't really be rehabilitated. Sometimes you outgrow, certain types of crimes, property crimes or whatever. But sex offenses is once that person's reached that level of violence, that's something that stays with them, that they don't ever, outgrow. So Lou believed that this killer was either apprehended on another case and incarcerated where he couldn't reoffend after a period of time, don't know when, or he was dead. And that's still something we wrestle with now, 28 years later. If we do get a match on the ID identification through the forensic evidence, the DNA, will this case be prosecutable? Which we hope. This person needs to be held accountable. One of the things that John Ramsey does bring out in the docuseries and on the 2020 special, and whenever he speaks, he talks about this, is how cold cases all over the country have been solved using DNA genetic profiles of private databases, 23andMe and other public databases. And that's something that, as far as we know, the Boulder police have refused to do. Don't know why. That's something that John Ramsey and our team, our Smith family team, have several times tried to encourage. We even said we'll use our GoFundMe account. If there's a cost, we'll pay for the lab expenses because they're not free. And we do have some funds left in our account. We spent down probably $45,000-$50,000 out of what we've collected so far, but we still have money that we'd commit, to using private labs to test, the DNA, to retest, the DNA on the clothing or what was taken from the autopsy, because you use, more modern technologies. You can sample smaller sample sizes. We're down to nanograms and picograms when it comes to DNA analysis. So we've offered, to use what financial, or we'll try to raise more money if that's the hindrance. We had heard at one point that, that all of this DNA testing costs a lot of money, and, they may not have the budget, to support that. I don't know if that's true. Boulder's a fairly wealthy community, and I would think, a high profile case like this, they would fund whatever the city, would fund the police department to pay for that testing. But, if that's not possible, well, we certainly will help, any way that we can.
I want to go back real quick to what you said about the killer either dead or incarcerated, and I have a couple of points or a question on that. Has your investigation and the investigative team looked into similar crimes that were committed in the area or like within a certain radius? And also, is it possible that someone would intentionally get themselves arrested for a completely different crime so they could be incarcerated, which would take any like suspicion off of them? Like someone could get arrested for armed robbery.
Mm-hmm.
The person who committed this murder could intentionally get arrested for armed robbery, get put in jail, and no one's looking for,
Mm-hmm.
someone who's a sexual assailant to be in jail for armed robbery. Is that a possibility?
It is a possibility. Well, there was a lot of pieces in there, so I can say just generally that geez, Lance, I'm not quite sure how to unpack this, but
I stumped you. I told you.
But today, any felon in Colorado who's arrested on a felony, when they're incarcerated, their DNA sample was taken. But if they were arrested, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that may not necessarily be the case, because the collection of DNA in incarcerated individuals, that's evolved over time, and mostly because, there's been a case and now that leads to legislation. For example, today, all sexually violent predators in Colorado are required, to submit their DNA, which goes into the CODIS, the Combined DNA Information System that the FBI has. So theoretically, and we believe this to be the case, that JONBENÉT's, that the DNA from the JONBENÉT investigation is there in CODIS, that was taken at the autopsy from her fingernails and her panties, and then the 2008 analysis with the long johns. Excuse me. We're told that that's in CODIS. But if, for example, Lance, the person that you're talking about, this hypothetical person, if they were arrested on an auto theft 5 years ago, would that necessarily, and they're convicted, who knows where, in Mesa, Colorado, and they're sentenced to the county jail, then their DNA probably wouldn't be in the system. So it's not an absolute that anybody who goes into the sex offender registry in Colorado has their DNA, because it depends on when they would go in. Also, if somebody's transferred from another state to Colorado, their DNA isn't brought in either. And so there are loopholes. If somebody's incarcerated before that legislation's enacted, and maybe we can catch them on the way out. We've done that. Colorado Springs Police Department did that to solve a 30-year-old case that I talk about in my book. And so that's a possibility too. But but not every state's the same. Some other states, they're not required, to do the submittal, to CODIS. So it's still kind of hit and miss. Let me go back to your first part of your question, Lance, and that was what our team has done with our limited resources. We have followed up leads that have been sent directly to us. I might also mention that we've gotten some leads after the docuseries aired through our GoFundMe, and we did get some over the years to the GoFundMe, because you can not only just make a donation, but you can pass on a tip or lead. And so we've gotten leads through our GoFundMe account, to include some that came in after the docuseries has aired. And so some of the leads that have come in from other sources, emails, as a result of the docuseries, also went to the Ramsey family, and at least one of those leads also went to the Boulder Police Department. So if our team are getting leads, I would have to believe that the Boulder Police Department tip line has been blowing up, since the Netflix and the 2020 and, all of the talk that's going on now, to include, with your guys' podcast too, because there's a lot of swirl. The reason I wrote this book, multiple reasons, but one is to try to, as Lou always said, you have to stir the pot on a cold case to keep it from growing cold. And I think that's what my book did. It stirred that pot. But I think what the docuseries did that came out last month is it moved that pot to the front burner. And now, because of guys like you and the 2020 special, the pot is really, the heat's been turned up on the pot. And there's more people helping stir this pot and asking questions, and people, who have thought, well, I thought, I had an uncle or whoever, that might have been involved with this. I think that now we're seeing so much more interest and attention. And I think this will continue through next week, when the anniversary date, we would typically see, every year, things come up on the news and different programs. I think this is probably the best opportunity that we've had in the last 28 years to really get that right lead that we need. And we hope, and we don't care if this is the FBI, Boulder PD, Boulder DA, CBI, we don't care who solves this case. We just want to see the case solved. And if there's something our team can do, we're continually trying to support that effort any way we can. We just don't want, and this was Lou's dying wish. He said, I just don't want this case to die with me. So we're very encouraged with the kind of the electricity that's been generated this season and through everything. And so we're so appreciative, Tim and Lance, of what you and your program and your listeners, your viewers are doing, because that's what needs to happen to solve this case. We need to keep it alive. We need to keep the momentum going forward.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we are happy to contribute in that way. That is sort of the mission of this show. I have just a few more questions if you've got some
Mhm.
more time here.
Certainly. Hmm.
Um, Now, I know a lot of the comments mention how JonBenét was abused or potentially abused by her parents. Is there any evidence
Hmm.
of abuse of JonBenét at the hands of the Ramsey parents or the
Absolute.
family? I
Yeah.
should say?
Absolutely none. And in fact, in this case, there's evidence to the contrary, to include a very well respected, experienced pediatrician who had seen JonBenét through, she was only 6 years old, but he had seen her over 2 dozen times. And he went on record and signed an affidavit saying, listen, I know this little girl. I've been with her, several times every year throughout her growth, throughout her childhood, since she was a little girl. He says there has never ever been an unexplained bruise or any indication at all that that the parents had ever abused, that this child has ever been abused by anybody. But then, when you hear John Ramsey's older parents, and then Burke, who was Patsy and John's child. When you listen to these children, the Ramseys, not only do they say we were never beaten, but they go on about how loved they were and the parents. So it's completely out of their character, their pattern, and it's just hard to fathom any parent that would stage, a violent sexual assault to cover up for an accidental death, and convince the other parent that hey, you've got to go along with this, and that's just beyond rational thought.
It makes you wonder where those rumors even start from in the first place,
Yeah.
because yeah, in the comments people will say something like, I heard she was abused, and
Hmm.
so there's tracks or something to that
Yeah.
effect. And
Or
to
a
hear
lot
that
of people
a
point.
doctor actually went on record and
Yeah.
to say this,
Yeah.
that seen
Yeah.
her how many times in her life, like 12 times, you said, a dozen times,
No, I think it was over 20, like 24,
like
26
2 dozen
times.
times, like
And what
regular visits.
Yeah, oh, even more so. Not only just wellness visits, but Patsy, because small town and pediatrician's just down the street. So anytime JonBenét would get a sniffle or cold, Patsy was always taking her, or Burke, always taking the children in, to see the doctor. So this doctor was intimately familiar with this little girl, this little patient. And he said, this is just bizarre. These parents are not, the type of parents that would abuse their child, let alone sexually abuse the parents. And when you look at how, what was their life before this happened, what was their life afterwards, there was never any domestic violence in the home. There was not one police report. It's the opposite. It's the evidence of them being a loving, supporting couple and family. They were active. The parents were, especially Patsy, in both children's school. They were active in their church. When the first persons who come to the Boulder home, this is before JonBenét's even her body's found, is the priest from the Episcopal Church. He was called, and he's leading prayer vigils in the Ramseys home, which was part of the contamination of the crime scene. But still, the point was that the morning after Christmas, their priest is there in their home, leading prayer vigils. So that's not the type of people who would be involved in any kind of a family sexual you know uh, abuse situation, and that never happened afterwards either.
Yeah, it also occurred to me that the ransom note probably would have been a lot shorter
Mhm.
if this was a staged event. I mean, that makes no
Mhm.
sense. I mean, so much of the ransom note makes no
Yeah.
sense. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, it's really hard, Tim, when you try to get in the mind of a deviant person because they're not rational. And so when you're trying to apply your logic and your rational thought, it misses that because none of us, can really get into that person's mind. And, they're not rational people. They're almost always narcissists, that they think the law doesn't apply to them. They can do whatever they want to. And when you start adding, the sexual violence that was exhibited in this case, the foreign object penetration. That quickly gets outside of my ability, to think how this person would think, and those are thoughts that are not healthy to dwell on anyway. So, um, it's hard to put any rationalization to irrational behavior.
Yeah, well said. And there was a conversation that we had, I think it was one of our first conversations, where you had emphasized that a lot of this is trying to prove negatives, and that's really tough to
Right.
do. And
Yeah.
that's something
Yeah.
that I've just repeated since then, because we
Mhm.
see it in
Yeah.
a lot of the stories that we talk about with missing
Yeah.
individuals or murdered individuals, these cold cases, is that
Yeah.
the compulsion to present a negative in order to prove it wrong is
Right.
always there, and it does so much damage.
Yeah. What a great thought, Lance. And I'm glad you brought that up again. As far as I know, the police report, and there was over like 10,000 pages that Lou, passed on. The only print, latent print that was found in the home that's unidentified is a palm print on the inside of the wine cellar on the door on the inside of the door where JONBENÉT's body was found, that palm print has never been identified. But there was some speculation, it may be true, that the killers, maybe they wore gloves, that's why they didn't leave, fingerprints, or maybe the Boulder police who, did not do a thorough job of investigating the crime scene the first time they were there because they overlooked the body altogether. They didn't even go into that room. How thorough of a job did they do, in dusting for fingerprints, collecting fingerprints? So to say, well, there's no fingerprints, on the duct tape, or there's no fingerprints on the garrote, or something, that proves that it's a family member. Well, no, it doesn't. It just means that there was no fingerprints identified or collected. So it doesn't prove a negative doesn't prove positive. So.
right. Yeah, I also feel like if this was a Ramsey family,
Mm-hmm.
murder, Patsy probably would have, or someone would have chosen to use something other than Patsy's personal
Mm-hmm.
paintbrush
Mm-hmm.
to make that
Mm-hmm.
garrote.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And
can
that's
you tell us
another
a
thing.
little bit? Mhm.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just going to ask, can you tell us a little bit more about the garrote and about
Mm-hmm.
the slip knot? I know we talked about the cord
Yeah.
or the cable being uncommon, but also the
Mm-hmm.
knot. How common or
Yeah.
uncommon was that slip knot?
The slip knot was not necessarily common, and it took somebody who had some knot tying skill, to tie that so that the more that she struggled, the tighter it got. I don't think I could have reconstructed that, but the really intriguing use of the paracord 550 is on the garrote. And I'd worked over 100 homicides in my 30-year career. Lou had worked over 200 homicides in his 32-year career. And he and I talked about this many times. Neither one of us had ever personally been on a murder where a garrote was used. It's very unusual. And and what's also unusual in this one is it was fashioned in situ, in place, with material that was readily at hand. And that's what I was going to mention, Tim, when I started to interrupt you a minute ago, and I'm glad you brought this question up about the garrote with the paintbrush, is there are a few people, perhaps, that may have specialized military training, SEALs or maybe Rangers or Special Forces, who've been taught how to fashion a garrote, to take out a sentry, come up from behind. And, we've all seen, mob movies, where somebody might have been executed with a garrote, using a piano wire or, fashion with a guitar string or something like that. But Lou and I, neither one had ever seen this. This is a highly unusual murder device. There's also not just the garrote that was used to cause her death, but also she was bludgeoned, and we didn't mention that she had a depressed skull fracture, an 8-inch skull fracture running laterally along the top right side of her head, to the point that the fracture that was depressed, the skull was actually forced in. And some people said, well, that shows that Patsy, in a fit of rage because of this recurring bedwetting incident, bumped her head against, the bathtub. Well, that's bizarre, because that would not have created this sufficient of a fracture. Lou had found a medical doctor who examined, not the coroner, but another doctor who examined through the photos. And he said his expert opinion was that the force that would have been required to create this depressed skull fracture would be equivalent to falling off of a 3-story building and landing on her head. And that's highly unusual too, when you have 2 causes of death. You usually have 1 cause of death or another cause of death. But here, the coroner, who again was a very competent pathologist, he had 2 causal factors in the death: the strangulation, using the manual strangulation using a device, which is unusual. Most strangulations, in a fit of rage, would be, using your hands. Here, somebody's fashioned this garrote. And then the bludgeoning, with some it took an object, to cause that. Lou believed that the object was possibly the aluminum baseball bat that was found outside of the Ramseys home on the north side of the residence. And there was a fiber from the carpet that came out of the basement. So I think he's probably right there. But the garrote was fashioned in the boiler room while JONBENÉT is still alive and she's struggling. And we know that because some of her hair was entangled in the knot, and you can see that in the crime scene photos. So this killer has the presence of mind to get her from her bedroom on the 2nd floor to the basement, to this room that's secluded. He's now creating, the garrote first, then the ligatures around the wrists, and he reaches over into the paint tray and finds this paintbrush, and he breaks it into 3 parts. The bristled end he just deposits back into the paint tray. The middle end is what he uses to fashion this garrote, this really unusual, elaborate device that's used to control her. But the 3rd piece, the tip, that's what I was trying to insert a while ago, Tim, a minute ago, was that the tip of that paintbrush is not in the body. It's not at the crime scene. It's gone. It's missing. So this killer had to have taken the tip of that paintbrush out of the home, along with the duct tape, along with the stun gun, along with, what was left of the cordage. So that's extremely unusual. The only time that Lou or I had ever seen, something similar on a sexual assault might be where the killer takes something personal of the victims. It might be an undergarment or something, takes that with them as kind of a trophy or something to, relive, this event. Very, very unusual MO.
Yeah, and I know in the Douglas book, I guess he said that the killer was mission driven and not MO driven, which I found interesting and never really considered anything like that. But he sort of mentioned that as a reason why there's never been another similar crime.
Well, I like that analogy. I never got to meet John Douglas, but he was very well respected within the FBI, with the behavioral sciences unit. I'd worked with some other people with BSU, and matter of fact, the first violent crime from Colorado, the first entry into the VICAP program, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, CO, I'll never forget the number, CO-35, 35th one in the nation, was a case that Lou and I had worked together, a very violent murder, when we were partners. And so I had gotten to know the people at VICAP and the behavioral sciences. And John Douglas was very well respected within the Bureau and within the law enforcement community. And he supported Lou's intruder theory, and he also said, this would not be consistent with a parental, murder and staging this. This is not what we're looking at. And I think that added a lot of credibility to Lou. And again, Lou started with a lone voice in the wilderness. It wasn't the Ramseys, and more voices have added on there. But I think John Douglas's voice caused a lot of people to wait a minute. This is a very credible person who's analyzed this. But I think what the docuseries and Netflix did was even take that to the next level, where it said, here you can see, listen to what Lou Smith is explaining, look at the photographs of the autopsy with the stun gun, look at the depressed skull fracture from the autopsy. Does this look like this little girl was accidentally, bumped her head, against the bathtub? And I think it really did start bringing in sufficient evidence that people are saying, now, wait a minute, this really doesn't look like what we've been told all along. And no wonder Lou, who really did have the best view of the evidence and the experience to analyze it and interpret it, why he really did believe it was an intruder.
Absolutely. And John, I did want to ask you about the press conference from Boulder PD on December 30th, 1996, and the contrast between that press conference and what the NYPD did regarding the murder of CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson.
Yeah. Well, what a fascinating case to watch, and the contrast between what Boulder PD did back in 96 and what NYPD did just here within the last couple of weeks are remarkable. And NYPD, and I've worked with some of those homicide detectives over the years, and they're very experienced, very well trained, very well supervised, and very committed. They in the case with the press conference, for example, they came out that day and shared information in great detail. They talked about spent shell casings, what was written on the shell casings. That press conference was followed up the next day as they got more information, and they started putting out, those video clips immediately about what this guy looked like, even though, he was wearing a hoodie and whatever. And what they started doing was getting the community involved. And what that press conference was a textbook on how to conduct an excellent press conference. They had the police commissioner, they had the deputy chief of investigations there. They'd written out what they wanted to say. It had all been choreographed to where it was, in my mind, one of the best press conferences I've ever seen, and it helped them identify the killer, get people involved. People started calling in, and they started getting experts' opinions. And one of the things that NYPD knows very well, it's called ComStat. And part of this came out of community-oriented policing in the 70s and 80s when I was active. Some of it came after 9/11. And particularly with Homeland Security, using technology, facial recognition, those kinds of things. But what they know very, very well is a principle, crime production or investigation principle that's referred to as early identification and rapid incapacitation. early identification, rapid incapacitation. So what that means is the quicker we can get this person identified, then the quicker we can incapacitate them. We can get them arrested off the streets. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened in Boulder 26 years ago. They did not, in fact, they delayed early identification. They delayed that by not revealing the evidence of who, like the DNA that excluded the family. They've kept the family under this umbrella of suspicion. That media conference, and I watched it live. And this public information officer, when she makes the statement that, well, we've got DNA from the Ramsey family, except for Patsy, and then she deviates and she gives her opinion, and she says, oh, whether she was, too distraught or whatever. Well, one, the information again is false. Patsy had given the information, and I was a public information officer for Colorado Springs PD, and I spoke many times in front of the media when I was the sheriff. And you never give your opinion. My opinion might be this was a horribly brutal crime, and whatever, but you don't give your opinion. You state your facts. And that's what they did with NYPD, is they gave facts, one fact after another. They updated the media the next day, and that's what helped lead to this killer being arrested in another state in a McDonald's, because they got the community involved. Well, in Boulder, they did the opposite. They continued to, provide misinformation. They didn't even have a press conference for the first several days until the 30th. And then when they did, it was kind of scripted, to again put pressure on the parents and feed into the tabloids. And when you don't have a system where you're periodically giving information to the media, then they have to go out, because they get pressure too. So they're looking for, the story, and they're not being fed. And so they, in this case, some real horrible things that the media did that compounded what was going on with the police and the lack of information, is someone was able to convince a Boulder area law enforcement officer, not with the Boulder PD, to provide them inside information for a fee, for $50 an hour, for whatever we want to do. The crime lab that was the independent photo lab that the crime lab with Boulder PD was using to develop the crime scene photos. The photos were purchased by some tabloids so that they could, put some of the crime scene photos out. And the media, to include the local media in the Denver metro area, they were using their sources, and some of those sources were police officers who, well, I can't talk on, condition of anonymity or whatever their statement was, but they were providing, well, I heard there's no footprints in the snow, and I heard there was no point of entry. And the media, because they didn't have any other information, and they couldn't run this past anybody with the Boulder PD that was answering them, they ran with that. And they had a lot of anonymous information or single source information or undisclosed sources. And so the media compromised. And this comes out, in the docuseries that Netflix did about how the media took shortcuts. And I think not only was the Boulder Police Department to be embarrassed, the way this was mishandled, but I think the media in some of the professional news reporters and journalists, who bought into this too, and contributed to this. I thought it was a real example of how not to do something back then. And if nothing else, and this is one of the reasons I wrote the book, was I hope there could be some lessons learned, on how to properly investigate a crime such as this, a violent crime, but also how to report it, how to share it with your community in a factual way.
Very good.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, unbelievable,
Yeah.
the work that you've put into it, and the work that the investigative team has put into it, and the fact that this is decades and decades on, and still, like I think you said, there's this electricity that you can feel, or this energy that is seeming to be building right now. It's remarkable to me that there aren't any clear answers, but I'm with you on that. I feel that there is some energy, some buzz, and something that is going to come forward. I don't have any idea of the time frame, but it has that feeling. So I think you're right.
Yeah. Well, let's hope, Lance. And Tim, thank you both for having me back on your show. I don't know if we're out of questions, but I just wanted to, again, acknowledge the work that you guys are doing and the support for my book, for this story, for Lou and JONBENÉT. You know, getting the truth out there is sincerely appreciated, not just by me, but by, you know, everybody that's involved. So thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge of this case, and your time here on this live show. I think it was great, and we're finally getting these negative comments here in the chat. But we're pretty much coming to the end of this conversation. But yeah, I don't know. Is someone saying that Patsy's ambidextrous? I don't know. And again, we did speak about the pineapple, and we did speak about the ransom note. So I would ask those commenters, Ogford and CCCMMM13, to scroll back or look back in the conversation for those moments to be addressed. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't. We're back to one of the first comments here about evidence and how it can lead you in one of two ways, and it's really fascinating to me. But yeah, personally, I don't think Patsy being ambidextrous is evidence of anything.
No, even if she was, but this is something that I'm kind of in a unique position to comment on, because how many people out there have actually met Patsy Ramsey? Well, I have. How many have met John Ramsey? Well, I have many times. I've not met Burke, but I've met John Andrew, and I sat down for a couple hours with Patsy and John and Lou in Colorado Springs when I was still the sheriff. And how many other people have actually talked to violent criminals or arrested them or investigated homicides or notified grieving parents, you know, that their child's not coming home. And I have done that. But when someone says, you know, I heard this about Patsy and whatever, you know, that's based upon information that they've received from somewhere, you know, from the media or whatever, or some experience in their life. But again, a unique kind of experience was, you know, ask them, have you met Patsy? I mean, well, you won't now, she's deceased, but you know, when she was alive, did you have the opportunity to sit and talk to her? And what was your opinion of her? And after 2 hours, there was no doubt in my mind that she was a poor, grieving, distraught mother. But Lou was a better judge of character than I was, or I'll ever be. And he spent many, many more hours with both John and Patsy. And he walked away absolutely convinced, you know, from meeting them. And then you compare that with the physical evidence. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that Lou, that, you know, had the privilege of knowing that family, you know. And then you contrast that with other violent, you know, offenders. And someone says, well, yeah, I thought, you know, this guy was, you know, really strange. And it doesn't surprise me to be involved with this. The Ramseys family is the exact opposite. You know, they were a very successful, very loving couple, very successful with the business and their personal lives, their spiritual lives, and completely out of character. So, yeah, the person who did this, this violent sexual murder, is not, you know, loving parents.
I just have one quick question. How long was it before they called 911 after they found the body?
Well, it's the other way around. They called 911 shortly after 5 a.m. when Patsy found the note, and the police, to their credit, they arrived at the Ramsey home within 3 minutes. So when the call came in at 5-something a.m. through 911, within 3 minutes, Boulder police were on the front step of the Ramsey home. And then, they brought in other investigators. One of the bad things they did is they didn't secure the crime scenes. Another bad thing is the first responder officer read the ransom note and then handed it back, and then they handed it to the supervisor who arrives, and then they handed it to the priest, and they handed it to the next person. So the ransom note, the ransom note gets handled and passed around to many other, people. So it gets contaminated. The crime scene's contaminated. But it wasn't until early afternoon. I think it was like 7 hours after the police had been there and processed to the crime scene, was the body found. And that was when the family is waiting for the phone call from the kidnappers, to say, well, you need to take this $118,000, over here, and then we'll release your daughter. And it was one detective, Linda Arndt, who had been left at the crime scene, waiting for that call to come in. And it was supposed to come in at 10 a.m. according to the note. And 10 a.m. comes and goes, and John Ramsey, Patsy too, they're anxious. Well, what's happening? Who's doing what? Why aren't the FBI here? And so Linda Arndt gives John a task of, search the house again, see if there was anything that was overlooked, anything out of place. And so when he's following her directions, she says, take one person with you, one of the guys, and search the house again. And that's when they go downstairs in the basement, and that's when the body's found. But by then, it's over 7 hours, maybe closer to 8 or 9 hours after the initial 911 call when the body's found.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. There was some comments in there about how the family wasn't like eagerly awaiting the call, and how they weren't acting in a consistent way that, parents who cared act. And I mean,
yeah, I know where part of that may have come from, Lance, and it's addressed in the docuseries, maybe even in the 2020 special with Detective Linda Arndt, who none of these detectives had ever worked a homicide case, let alone, a kidnap or ransom. So they're kind of, flying blind here. And she's in the living room watching the parents, waiting for the phone to ring. And one of the things she comments on in the docuseries is that she sees John Ramsey go into the kitchen or wherever, and he's starting to go through the mail. And she thinks that he's being very nonchalant, and disinterested, and just looking at the mail that's come in. And when you hear John Ramsey's explanation on the docuseries on the 2020 special, he says that's completely, off base. He said these are letters, that came in through the mail slot of our front door, and they were piling up. So he says I picked those up, and I'm looking through there just to see if there's another correspondence, another letter, from the killers, the abductors. And so so people who are saying, oh, they're not acting right, they're not, distraught or whatever. John is trying to keep his wits about him, as he explains it. He says, I'm trying to get the money together. I'm trying to, figure out how to do everything I can to get my daughter back safely. And so, this is such an unusual case, a kidnap for ransom, that it was the way things have unfolded. It's, well, how are they supposed to act? So I think there's a lot of disinformation, in people's opinions that, are it's just like the comment of Patsy being ambidextrous. Well, is she or isn't she? Doesn't matter. Is that going to change the DNA? So this is a DNA case. We've got to find who that unknown male DNA belongs to. That's on 3 different locations, on her clothing, on her body. That's the key. That's what we got to find. Then everything else will fall into place. And if we can use databases, that's what other law enforcement agencies are doing all the time, to crack these. That's how the Golden Gate Killer was abducted. You didn't have to have the killer, if you can get in that killer's family tree, and.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
we lost
John.
him.
Oh, we lost him. That was abrupt there. I don't know what happened. I don't think I clicked anything.
No.
To remove him.
I definitely didn't.
We'll give it a moment. Maybe he will rejoin, but we're coming to the end of this anyway. And I do want to thank everyone for contributing in the chat. That's Ogford and Susie and CCC, MMM13 and Dixie, and really just everyone who contributed with the questions. Definitely a big thank you. The final question I did want to ask John was, as a former homicide detective, wouldn't it have been relatively easy to prove the Ramseys committed this murder in their own house if they had?
I mean, I wish he was here. I wish he didn't. I
Yeah,
know. Yeah, exactly.
maybe he won't, but yeah, that is definitely one question that that I wonder, and him, John Wesley Anderson, with his experience, certainly could help us answer that. But I mean, my take is it probably would have been. I mean, we're almost 30 years removed from this murder, and you know, there was a grand jury that tried to indict and you know, have the Ramseys charged, but
right.
ultimately the prosecutors chose not to, because I just don't think there is any evidence. I know we're talking about just the topic of evidence, what it is and what counts as evidence, and really I think the defense would have won a very easy case had they tried John and Patsy Ramsey.
Yeah, and also he did mention the CBI report, which he forwarded to us, and unless this is forged and fake, it has the words that exclude John and Patsy from the exhibit items that they list, which are the exhibit items that were found on and around her body, and they have they've been excluded, and this is an official report. So this isn't just us kind of regurgitating, you know, articles that have been written and talking about the same facts over and over. I'm looking at it right now. I mean, it's just never been just never been publicly like put out there.
That's publicly available.
Yeah, but people don't. I mean, not to the point where like people are referencing it on a.
That's correct.
As part of their argument.
However, that, you know, if you want to Google that, people can find that. I believe there was a Fox News article a couple of years ago with that information, and it's clearly not forged or anything like that. You know, the one we got from John. So,
and on our last conversation that we had with John that was recorded, right? It was the last one where we just go over it a little bit and some of the confusing statements that are written on there. He puts those into perspective and explains them. It's just people who aren't used to reading statements like this probably don't like. I just didn't get it the first time. You know, you need somebody who is in law enforcement to describe and clarify some of the things that are just
it's not the hardest. Definitely not the easiest thing to read if you know we're not used to reading a document like that. So, but okay, everybody, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and big thanks to John Wesley Anderson of Lou and JONBENÉT. Definitely pick up that book. There are links in the comments section. You can go right to Amazon and pick up this book. Just type in Lou and JONBENÉT. Also, check out the documentary, the new Netflix documentary, Cold Case: Who Killed JonBeNét Ramsey, and the 2020 special that I did not check out. I'm gonna have to look at that.
Yeah. And if anybody knows where my copy of the book is, please let me know.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We really appreciate. Oh, there's John.
He's back.
John. All right, John.
Sorry, guys. I don't know what.
No.
Timed out.
No
there.
Problem.
Sorry. Let me see if I can get my phone back up there. Are you still looking at me and hearing me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I apologize to your viewers and listeners that said technical glitch, but I'm back, and I know we were just finishing up with a final question or two or a comment.
Yeah, there was one final question I had here, and it's to you directly. As a former homicide investigator and detective, wouldn't it have been relatively easy to prove that the Ramseys committed the murder if they had?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. With the circumstances, had it been one of the family members, I think that would have been solved. What again is interesting in this one of the lead detectives, Steve Thomas, thinks it's Patsy, absolutely convinced it is. And then another lead detective, Lynn Arndt, thinks it's the dad, John Ramsey, and they both can't be right. So what they're doing is they've come up with, a suspect that they're trying to, fit the evidence into, while they're ignoring the evidence of the intruder. And that's not going to get you very far down the road.
Absolutely. Wow. Well,
I'm
thank you
glad you
so
popped
much,
back on to
John.
answer that.
Yeah, we
Because
really
Tim
appreciate
asked
it.
me, and I had no idea. I had to
Well,
remind him I'm
I'm glad
not
I'm
I'm
back
not a
and I
former
can,
detective.
thank both of you again and your listeners for being involved today and for you guys hosting the program, and wish you and yours a Merry Christmas.
Oh,
Thank you
you.
so
You
much.
too.
Merry Christmas to you as well, and happy holidays to everyone listening. We really appreciate you hanging in there with us. Thanks a lot. All right. Cut the stream. That was